So while it's loading, maybe I'll start with a little bit of background. I'm going to be talking this evening about self-organized or artist-led art schools, with a particular focus on those that have been flourishing around the world in the last 10 or 15 years. This is something I became aware of probably in about 2010. And through traveling, through talking to artists, to curators, to writers, I was really intrigued about why there were so many projects, so many education and learning platforms that were choosing to describe themselves as schools, as academies, as universities. It seemed like something that was kind of new to me. It wasn't about a kind of exhibition as school. It was an endeavor that was trying to pitch itself as something slightly more long-term. So through a number of conversations, I became increasingly involved with some of these kinds of projects. And that led in 2010 to a number of conversations with friends in London, Anna Collin, Sarah McCrory and Lawrence Taylor, which evolved into a project called Open School East, which opened its doors in 2013 in a former public library in East London. I'll talk a bit more about that later on. But in the end, these two experiences kind of came together and developed into the book that Hildegard mentioned already, that will be published later this year, which is really an attempt to kind of track some of this quite contested terrain. It takes the form of about 20 different conversations with artists and curators around the world, and to think about if these alternatives or self-organized platforms are providing a kind of oppositional response to art education at the moment, what kinds of proposals, modest or otherwise, are they putting forward? If we are to take these seriously as alternatives, what might they mean for the ways in which art education will shift in the future? My title this evening is borrowed from this graphic novel that some of you might be familiar with. It's by Daniel Close. It was from the 1990s. And I suppose I like the title for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, this slightly tongue-in-cheek sense of a kind of reports from, a kind of report from the seamy underbelly of art education in the kind of LA Confidential mold. And then on the other hand, the fact that by the mid-90s, you actually could have art schools becoming an object of ridicule in this kind of way, that they could be kind of satirized to the extent that they're a place where rich guys who can't draw are being taught by has-been famous artist professors, or that they could be described as the biggest scam of the century. And I think by this point we're pretty familiar with the certain kinds of critiques of art education at the moment, but I was intrigued that within the course of only about 60 or 70 years from some of what Regina was describing, these radical experiments in pedagogy of the 20s could be devalued to such an extent that in the form of a graphic novel they could be kind of laughed at in this way. And so I suppose before I do attempt to think a little bit about what's going on right now and what might happen next, I'm going to start by looking back a little bit to kind of ask the question, how have art schools been changing this last 70 or 80 years, and what's the kind of current state of that landscape? So the critique of the art school is by now pretty familiar. It was put succinctly and perhaps a tad hyperbolically by Boris Groys in 2009 when he stated that today art education has no definite goals, no method, no particular content that can be taught, no tradition that can be transmitted to a new generation, which is to say it has too many. So his usual taste for paradox you can kind of see coming through there. But it's I want to leave that hanging and maybe we'll come back to it. So to jump back a bit, and this is picking up a few of the threads that Regina was kind of setting out earlier. In the years immediately after 1919, and in the wake of the First World War and of the Russian Revolution, you have a number of these kind of radical art schools happening around the world. I'm going to focus just on a trio here. I won't say much more about the Bauhaus, but it opened in 1919. The same year that Kazimir Malievich's group, Unovis, opened in Vitebsk, modern-day Belarus. Unovis is relatively well-known now, but it's an acronym for Champions of the New Art in Russia. Relatively short-lived, you'll notice, and this is kind of a theme that we'll be coming back to. And then finally, Vuketamus, which was came about through the merging of two to technical workshops in Moscow, and which opened in 1920. It had some kind of overlap with Johannes Itten's colour theory of the time. I mean, why I want to start with this is because this trio of schools really represent a quite fundamental rupture from the way in which art was taught in the 19th century. Thierry de Doof has kind of talked about this in a tripartite model. He defined the ways in which art was taught in the 19th century as being about talent, about being a kind of innate talent that could be trained and guided, about imitation. That's in the double sense of imitating the tutors, but also imitating life. You know, much of this education, much of this tuition was happening in the life drawing class. And then finally about métier, kind of idea of it really being a profession or a vocation. Regina touched upon this, the way in which the Bauhaus broke from that idea of métier to something that was much more about experimentation, that was so much more about experience too. De Doof says that the Bauhaus model, as he calls it, updates this trio. Talent becomes usurped by creativity. Really the idea that anybody could be an artist kind of has its seeds here. Imitation is overtaken by invention, and métier by medium. And so to go back to that, the famous diagram of the Vorkurs, where you have the kind of the material really focused on, and which still has its, you know, it still underpins much of the way in which arts and design are taught at BA level in the West, has its roots here. I mean, what happened next is pretty well known. The Bauhaus had a kind of a huge influence all over the world, but perhaps nowhere more than in North America, where a number of the faculty went on to establish incredibly influential schools and programs. Moholy-Nagy went on to form the new Bauhaus in Chicago. There were also programs in Illinois, Harvard, elsewhere. But opening in the exact same year that the Bauhaus closed was Black Mountain College on the banks of Lake Eden in Blue Ridge Mountains. Joseph Albers, at the time, he could barely speak English, was one of the first and most important tutors there. Here you can see a class in the cabbage patch and teaching there. But I wanted to mention Black Mountain for a few reasons. Of course, it's very well known, but I think what's intriguing, though it's remembered now as this incredibly influential art school, it had quite a conflicted sense of its relationship to art schools. To the degree that the founder of Black Mountain, John Andrews Rice, when asked if Black Mountain was an art school, is said to have replied, "God no, art schools are the most horrible place on earth." And one of its earliest syllabuses described itself as proudly heretical. This was not something that put itself forward as an art school. In the 25 years of operation, it was also very small. Only about 1,200 students came through. Of those, only about 60 ever formally graduated. But of course, it has this outsized influence today. You know, we think about the people who came through there, from Rauschenberg through to Kenneth Noland, who grew up just down the road, through to Robert De Niro's dad actually studied there. He studied painting there. But as was picked up very early on, just a few years after Black Mountain opened its doors, in a long essay by Louis Adamic in Harper's Magazine, he said that at Black Mountain College, one is obliged to live as an integral part of a close-knit social unit, so close-knit that it has characteristics of a huge family. This is as important in the scheme as classwork. So the idea of the ways in which schools might be able to propose social formations, like new social formations, was pretty important to Black Mountain. It was also, just to give one example, the first college in the American South to integrate in the 40s. So, you know, this forward kind of thinking thing. But just to say, to go back to the point that only 60 people ever graduated from this. In the year that Black Mountain closed, 1956, 1957, in the US, only about 350 people received an MFA. That was the kind of point at which, that was the scale at which art education was there. 350 people had an MFA. To kind of skip forward 60 years to this year, in the US alone, about 100,000 people have received BAs, MFAs, PhDs relating to art. So this is the kind of scale of expansion that we're talking about when we're talking about what art education is today. So if we can think a little bit about the 20s and 30s as being, if we're going to define art schools as a kind of place of experimentation, as a place of rupturing from 19th century models, we might start to think about the post-war moment as a place of rapid expansion, professionalization. That happened in the US, of course, through the GI Bill that saw art schools proliferate and the courses proliferate too. Suddenly the idea of being a teaching artist was a viable profession. I'm just going to give one example here, and probably the best known, but CalArts in Valencia, just outside of Los Angeles, was founded by Walt Disney as a technical college to start with. He wanted to train animators to work at Disney. It pretty soon changed track. It took on a kind of slightly different cast. This is a photo from the late 60s. It's alleged that at this point one could take courses in both witchcraft and joint rolling as well. It's not maybe so well known for that these days, but one of the kind of key shifts at this point was, as one of the early slogans had it, as many curricula as students. And as John Baldessari liked to say at the time, everyone they took on was regarded as an artist. This was a kind of a shift again away from an apprentice model. These were all artists they were teaching. They were just there to work with them. Baldessari ran his post-studio course through the 70s and through the 80s, and he said, I wanted students to stop daubing away at canvas or chipping away at stone and to embrace a wider world. He does also often mention that he had a studio through the 70s and 80s. This was not a kind of total move to the post-studio. His colleagues there included Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, who ran the incredibly important feminist art program, and students included people like Suzanne Lacey. But to go back to de Duve and to his kind of holy trinity of art education in the 20th century, he sees this kind of 60s model as updating the Bauhaus model. So it's a kind of break from creativity and invention and medium to attitude, practice, and deconstruction. And he really kind of positions this as something that it does start to happen in the 60s. One of the ways in which it starts to happen is through something that, I mean, we're all so familiar with today as one of the kind of standards, even 50 years on, the crit. Michael Asher is perhaps the kind of best known or most infamous with his very long, sometimes 12 or 14-hour crits, where students would keep talking and talking and talking until they kind of talk themselves in and out of different kinds of interpretations. You can see him teaching here with, this is Mike Kelly up at the right, Douglas Herbler as well. So this idea of kind of talking the work into existence, of talking artists into existence, is seen by art historians like Howard Singerman, who for me is one of the most perceptive historians of art education in America, as being quite fundamental to the shift in the 60s and 70s to the way in which art was taught. Singerman states in his book, Art Subjects, that speech is now a requirement for the MFA. Jumping forward a bit more, because I need to get on to the contemporary. In 2001, there was an exhibition at LA MoCA curated by Paul Schimmel called Public Offerings. And what Public Offerings tried to do was to take a look at the 80s and 90s and focus on the very first bodies of work that artists exhibited out of art school. And in a way, it provides a bit of a retrospective of some of what were thought to be the most important art schools of the time. So it's the Goldsmiths of the late 80s, early 90s, it's UCLA of the early 90s, and so on. But what Lane Relier, the American art historian, notes in one of the catalogue essays is that hanging out, talking shop, and making connections with faculty and visiting artists has replaced the systems and codifications of pedagogy, of syllabi and seminars. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but Relier basically says, like, if you're looking for somewhere to blame the rise of relational aesthetics, look no further than the art school. Look no further than the crit. This is where that kind of talking happens. This idea now, I think of a kind of the art school as a very networked place in which students are making work that is equally networked and about their own networks and that of their tutors, is obviously very well known via the Stadelschule in Frankfurt. And in fact, its previous rector, Daniel Birnbaum, notes some of the difficulties involved with this new proximity that art academies had now had with the art market or art industry. He noted that the problem here was, should the school turn itself into a monastery that protects students from the evil forces outside, or should it invite the market in and become a kind of lively bazaar? It seems to me that the answer is neither and both. So this dichotomy between a monastery and a bazaar, I think, is something that is often being grappled with today. Ute Mette-Bauer goes a little bit further in an essay from a couple of years later, when she says that art schools and university studio art programs, previously free and open zones for experiments, have found themselves pulled further and further into the orbit of the art market. So to end this kind of episode of professionalization, I want to talk just briefly about what happens when art schools start to enter the orbit of the art market. One of the things that has happened that we're all very aware of is the issue of student debt. And just to take these three facts alone, the majority of the top 10 most expensive American universities are art schools. Tuition fees can exceed about $120,000. And student debt in the US now stands at $1.2 trillion. To put that in context, that's more than credit card debt. I mean, it's really extraordinary situation, and one that is very, very new too. Some of the implications of this have been the fairly high-level fiascos at a number of different American art schools in the last few years. This is an image from Cooper Union in New York, what was New York's last remaining free art school. What you can just about make out here is this photo was taken during the longest student sit-in in US history. And up at the top, it's students that are occupying the president of Cooper Union's office. You can see helium balloons, and just below it are a stack of pizzas that are being delivered via helium balloons by a collective of artists on ground level. But I should say the sit-in was prompted by the introduction of tuition fees, and tuition fees were in the end introduced, but they won some of their demands. Quite soon after, the entire MFA class, the first year MFA class at USC in Los Angeles, dropped out because of what they described as the reneging of USC on certain deals around stipends, around TA-ships and other things. One of the frequent criticisms that both the tutors who resigned from USC and the students made was that USC was being completely overtaken by a kind of Silicon Valley rhetoric, that the older ideas of creativity to kind of update, to do again, were being overtaken by disruption and by innovation. Frances Stark, one of the artists who in a very high profile way resigned around this time, put it quite clearly when she said art schools should promote thinking differently and not in the Apple sense. The unspoken implication being that the way in which USC, Roski and others are promoting free thinking is in the Apple sense. So, to kind of quote the American collective BFA, MFA, PhD, who've done some incredibly valuable work around student debt, what is a work of art in the age of $120,000 art degrees? The answer that they find is, well, of course, it's the subject of the loan repayment. Increasingly, with $1.2 trillion of student debt in the US, it will be the loan default as well. So, before I move on to kind of today, I think there is this prevalent worry that, to kind of quote the title of Alan Sekula's 1979 photo essay, school is becoming a factory. They're becoming increasingly industrialized, standardized. Students are no longer artists. In the CalArts way, they are consumers. This provides some of the backdrop for, I think, what will be my kind of main topic tonight. So I started out by talking, I've been noticing this last 5 or 6 years, as I'm sure many of you will have done, that we're seeing a kind of flourishing of all kinds of projects all over the world I know there are people here from Mexico City, through to Istanbul, through to St. Petersburg, in different kinds of contexts, setting up their own education platforms that define themselves critically, I would argue, as schools, academies, or universities. This, I think, is something relatively new. If you go back to the 60s to some like-minded initiatives, they're often defining themselves in opposition to the institution. You have the anti-University of London that John Latham was involved with. You have the kind of the unschool, the anti-school. Right now, people are, I think, in different ways thinking about what's at stake via self-institutionalizing. And I'm sure this will be a subject that comes up again tomorrow. to set a little bit of this scene, I wanted to kind of start with a partial selected chronology of some of these artist-run and self-organized art schools from about the last 15 or so years. Can you read this at the back? Yeah? Okay, good. It's a little small, but I mean, what you can kind of get a sense of just moving very quickly here. I chose slightly arbitrarily to start in 1999, but there may be arguments to do that. It's partly the ways in which many of these are nomadic projects. Many of them are itinerant. And they range in places from that have little provision for art education, like, for example, Cuba, through to places like Los Angeles that have many, many high-profile, quite wonderful MFA programs, the reasons for which maybe I'll go into. You can kind of see that in the kind of mid to late 2000s, there is really kind of a mass of these kinds of projects in different ways defined. And they're talking about themselves often as institutes, as academies, as schools. I can come back to some of these later. I mean, what's common to many of these is that they're relatively short-lived. When the energies of the founders kind of move elsewhere or kind of wither away, they tend to die with them. Often they last for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And maybe that's okay as well. Maybe they don't need to last much longer. They're almost exclusively free to attend. They're often anti-hierarchical. The idea of a tutor and a student and that vocabulary is often jettisoned in favor of participants or associates. And they often, although they're described as alternative, have an intriguing relationship to institutions, whether biennials or museums. They're often nestled within them or live beyond them, or are started with funding from those, or indeed commissioned by curators from those institutions, typically from the education departments rather than from the exhibition departments, which is notable. What I want to do is to focus a little bit on about half a dozen of these projects, to give a bit of a sense of how some of them work in different kinds of ways. There were certain initiatives I was planning to talk about, but I know that some of the people who are speaking tomorrow will be doing that anyway. So I'm trying to do things that wouldn't otherwise be discussed in the context of this conference. Yeah, before I do get onto that, I just wanted to dwell on this essay by Suhail Malick, who's written illuminatingly about this. He wrote that the recent artistic interests in education now look for education beyond the art school, by literally replacing the site of art education in non-institutional settings. Or, more powerfully and visibly, he writes, parasitizing other kinds of art institutions as educational initiatives. And I won't go into the kind of so-called educational or pedagogical turn at this point, but suffice to say that the last 10 years has seen a huge amount of exhibition platforms reimagining themselves as schools and other things too. Perhaps the most high-profile version of this was the cancellation of Manifesta 6 in 2006, which was an attempt to start an art school in Cyprus near the border, and which was cancelled last minute with certain lawsuits ensuing. But it had a significant afterlife, first in United Nations Plaza in Berlin, that was run by Anton Vidokul and others, and then Night School, both in Mexico City and at the New Museum in New York. But yeah, Suhail Malick kind of touches on the fact that many of these schools are not alternative in the sense of being completely separate from institutions, but rather they have an ambivalent and kind of reciprocal relationship with them. Maybe I'll come back to that. So the first of my case studies I wanted to focus on was this project by Pablo Guerra, who's a Mexican artist and educator who for about 25 years now has worked in different museum education departments. He's been working at MoMA for some time now. Guerra has a term, transpedagogy, that he coined, and in his 2011 book, Education for Socially Engaged Art, he elaborates on what he means by transpedagogy. But my understanding of the term is really it's a kind of education that goes beyond itself. It's a kind of art education that moves into new kinds of realms, in new kinds of modes. In 2003, Guerra established the School of Pan-American Unrest, which was really a kind of school as road trip. He took this yellow tent-like schoolhouse on a road trip that started at the very north of the Americas in Alaska and finished 4 months later, 14 countries later, the very southernmost tip of Chile. Guerra, and this is a quote from the book of mine that's coming out later this year, it was a kind of fiction, declaring that this continent was called Pan America. It took me 4 months to drive from Alaska to Chile. I created the structure of a schoolhouse, which I put together like a circus tent wherever I went. And essentially what Guerra did, and this is him in the kind of yellow tie in the middle there, everywhere he kind of stopped, whether that was at an arts institution or whether it was in a public plaza, he would work with local collaborators to talk through the idea of what this fictional country of Pan America might look like. And this, remember, is in 2003. It's in the kind of dark days of the Bush administration. And so thinking through what American foreign policy and exceptionalism might mean at this point, I think, was all the more urgent. Collectively, they would write a national anthem for this imagined country of Pan America and then perform it of the last day of the school. After that, they would pack up the schoolhouse and they would move on to the next city, and that was the project in itself. This is 2003, so it was before YouTube, before a lot of kind of social media we might use today. But Guerra also had a blog, and that was kind of quite crucial to the way in which the school of sorts was documented. Fairly well known by this point, I'd imagine, is the Cuban artist Tania Bruguera's school, Cathedra Arty de Conducta. And apologies for my pronunciation, but I will mangle the translation too, because it's a pun. It means essentially the kind of, in English, the school of behavior art, something along those lines. And it has as often with Bruguera's work, it's a play on words. It refers first to the fact that one of her first jobs after going to university was working in a kind of behavioral unit of a kind of youth, a criminal kind of place where teenagers would go and do art activities. And Bruguera would kind of lead those activities in this kind of juvenile detention center. So it had that kind of sense to it. But also in the late 90s, she went to Chicago to the School of the Art Institute to do an MFA in performance. And the idea of kind of behavior art, rather than the Western kind of idea of performance art, was something that she was quite interested in pursuing at this point. So it opened in 2002, soon after she'd had a somewhat frustrating experience of exhibiting at Documenta 11. She wanted to create something that she described as more of a kind of a long-term situation, she said. And she wanted to create a kind of school that produced a kind of active citizenry, is the kind of phrase she often comes back to, like that creates active citizens. So this is a kind of a move away from the Boycean kind of dictum of everybody is an artist to like every artist should be an active citizen. That was kind of one of the things she was trying to put forward here. And it again had a kind of interesting relationship to the art school, that it was not in fact alternative. You can see from these images that it was hosted in Bruguera's family home in the Havana Center. They would have about 15 students at a given time. But those students were essentially doing a kind of satellite degree from ISA, which is the main art school in Havana. And so it was a kind of accredited thing, but they would work and sometimes even live in her house, and that, again, became part of the school. So you can kind of see here some of the people who were teaching. On the left is, I think, Rikrit Tirovnija. On the right, I think, is Doug Aitken. So it was a fairly international cast of people that she was able to kind of pull in. They would come there for a week, and the way in which Bruguera would program it was that often one week's speaker would contradict what the week before speaker was saying. So you would have like Nicolas Bourriaud coming in to talk about relational aesthetics, and then you would have Claire Bishop coming in the week after saying everything Bourriaud said is complete nonsense, I disregard that. So it was a kind of, essentially she talks about it as like an antagonistic relationship, one week from another, changing perspective week on week, week on week. Bruguera said, I wanted a space where art could be experienced in a long-term situation. I wanted to create a space for freedom in Cuba, where I could start a discussion about how art can be political. To all of this, I wanted to make sure it was understood as a school. And this was a school, I should mention, that was also exhibited, first at the Guangzhou Biennial and then at the Havana Biennial too. And I think both of those attempts to exhibit the process of education were not without their problems, something that she's very alive to still. More recently, in fact last year, after suffering a kind of city arrest for most of the year, she started in the same space, the same family home, what she's calling the Hannah Arendt Institute of Artivism. And I'm sure many of you will be aware Bruguera's preoccupations for the last 5 or so years have been around what she calls arte utile, kind of translating to the idea of a kind of a useful art, or art as a social tool. Something she comes back to a lot is that it's time to put Marcel Duchamp's urinal back in the bathroom. We need to put the tools of art back into the world, back out of the gallery. She opened this institute with a marathon reading of Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, from the early 50s. It lasted about 100 hours, and at some point during this reading, the city actually sent these construction workers to dig up the road with pneumatic drills to drown out the reading itself, which at this point was being done with a microphone and an amp outside. But in the end, she kind of ended up talking to them about Arendt and about the ideas, and apparently they got on pretty well and kind of went away. It's all fine. But she's kind of thinking through about what happens next. She's actually doing a residency in London this summer, and will be going back to Cuba after that. So I would say this is a kind of a bit of a shift for her, and she's thinking a bit more in terms of social justice. She says the Hannah Arendt Institute is about how you can share knowledge about human rights and social justice. How can you enact and manifest this knowledge? My next case study is also an art school that was housed in an artist home. Copenhagen Free University was founded by a couple, Jacob Jacobsen and Henrietta Heise, in 2001. It was housed in their apartment in a northern neighborhood of Copenhagen. And really it was thinking about what it means to proclaim a private domestic space as a public institution. It was a kind of speech act, Jacob talks about often. He says, we declared our private home as a public institution. We wanted to value other kinds of knowledge, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in the living room, to the extent that classes would be taught in the kitchen, in their kids' bedroom, and so on. And they had a kind of residency program, as all universities should, but it was a kind of mattress on the floor. You know, it was very, very low key. So how should a university work here? What should it do for me and the people around me? What kind of university do we want if we go beyond the neoliberal university? And so in a way, this is something that Jacob and Henrietta describe as a kind of place where, in a way, the format of the school was the content. The kind of way, asking the kind of question of how do we live together and how do we teach each other, who gets to learn and from whom, really was the kind of content of the school as it lasted for 6 years. I should say it called itself a university. After they decided to close it down for different reasons, they were actually contacted by the Danish state, saying that if they were going to start it up again, they would not be allowed legally, that you can't start up your own university. And so when I last spoke to Jacob, he was actually thinking about starting a new project called Prison Hospital School, on the kind of basis that you can't start your own prison or hospital either, I suppose. But through these kinds of projects, and you can see the kind of just how compact, how intimate this is, they produced, for me, some really valuable research, often about some of these lesser known episodes of, there's a fly around here, of radical education in the 60s, particularly looking at the Free University of New York and the very, very short-lived Anti-University of London, which lasted for all of about 6 months in Shoreditch, very closely connected to both the Hornsey College sit-ins of 68 and also the anti-psychiatry movement. R.D. Lang was one of the collaborators. John Latham, who before he died was a quite frequent interlocutor of Jacob Jacobsen's, was also involved with the anti-university. And his idea of what he described of as anti-know, like no, K-N-O-W, or anti-knowledge, was something that Copenhagen Free University really sought to unpack. And so I think to kind of contrast it with Pablo Guerra's idea of trans-pedagogy, of a kind of education that goes beyond itself. Anti-no is a kind of idea of education that breaks down, that implodes, that kind of falls to pieces, that precisely does not go beyond those kinds of boundaries. A very different kind of environment is that of Fritz Haeg. Fritz Haeg was trained as an architect in the 90s, and for 15 or almost 20 years now has been pursuing a range of projects that's remarkably broad. They've ranged from edible estates, whereby he encouraged people to plant their front lawns as vegetable patches and allotments, through to crocheting, through to dance and yoga, and through to architecture for animals. In the early 2000s, as a kind of a new transplant to Los Angeles, he set up a series of projects called the Sundown salons, kind of informal monthly gatherings where artists, dancers, filmmakers, activists would gather at this quite remarkable property that he owned for about 15 years, a 1980s geodesic dome in the Glassell Park area of Los Angeles. It was on Sundown Drive, hence the name of the Sundown Salons and Sundown Schoolhouse. And there were a whole range of kinds of projects that developed out of that. In about 2006, it shifted to what he called the Sundown Schoolhouse. It took on, this is a kind of interior shot, you can get a bit of a sense of it. And then the kind of the space itself, there's a trapdoor essentially that kind of goes down into the kind of depths of this, and it's surrounded by gardens and vegetable allotments. But he set up this kind of school, and I was asking him about why did he choose the kind of the idea of the schoolhouse or the salon, both kind of somewhat archaic terms today. And he responded by saying, these strange spaces lent themselves well to people gathering, to performances, to ways of being with people that a conventional gallery wouldn't be conducive to. Salons were places where marginalized people had a voice. People who didn't have a lot of power in the mainstream society had an opportunity at home to gather. The home was the one place where they had agency. And this was a kind of a school that became itinerant as Fritz Haeg's kind of own practice became increasingly itinerant. So to give one example, in 2012, when he was invited to be part of an exhibition at the Hayward Gallery in London called Wide Open School, he essentially set up a geodesic dome on one of the terraces of the Hayward Gallery and ran the classes from there. And one thing he found from that itinerant model was that essentially the larger community that you're working in, the more niche a subject you can work on, because you can draw on a number of different communities and voices. So the project that he ended up pursuing in London was a kind of a history of queer home economics. And he was like, that was something that he absolutely couldn't have done in, say, like rural Northern California. But in London, there was that set of constituencies to work with in that kind of way. This last year or so, Fritz sold the geodesic dome, thinking that for about 15 years he had really been thinking about introducing the rural or the kind of the agricultural into the urban setting. And in fact, he's moved away from Los Angeles now to a former commune in Northern California called Salmon Creek Farm. There were still several people from the original commune living there, and he's since been working with them to develop something much more long-term. So moving away from the 1 or 3 semester kind of model that he was using in the Sundown salons to something that's much more about kind of an artist's life, to go back to that kind of that earlier phrase. And he sees that as a very much a long-term project, not 1 year, but more like 10 or 20. The public school, I'm imagining probably some of you will be familiar with too. This was something that I almost literally stumbled upon about 8 or 9 years ago. I was in Los Angeles in Chinatown and saw a small blue neon sign in one of the shopfront spaces, simply reading the public school. And so I walked in, and essentially what I found was this, minus the child with the balloon, but there was this kind of blackboard at the back. And the public school was a project that was set up by Sean Dockeray and Fiona Witten in LA in 2007. It grew out of a project space they'd ran there for a couple of years called Telic Arts. And essentially it styles itself as a school without a curriculum. The way in which it works is that it's essentially a website. Anybody can go on that website and propose something they either want to learn or that they want to teach. So courses there have ranged from, for example, a reading group of volume 1 of Marx's Das Kapital, through to a range of kind of slightly more esoteric things. When I first visited, they were midway through a program of classes about Lacanian knot tying, which I thought like relatively esoteric. But the way in which it was kind of modeled was a school that was flexible, that could be taken on anywhere. And in the kind of intervening 10 years or so, there have actually been branches of the public school popping up all over the world, in kind of Brussels and Philadelphia and kind of elsewhere. And the way in which Sean describes the school is saying that public didn't just mean that proposals came from the public. The name encapsulated the entire process. I realized that this procedural logic was entirely familiar. I probably just copied it from the way we're already just living on the internet. And so he talks about it as basically a kind of diagrammatic series. He said that he kind of had this idea for the school with just a kind of a very simple set of diagrams of like, well, this person teaches this, it's all free, it can happen anywhere. The committee here in the middle, the committee's name is DAN, which is a kind of joke around DNA, but a kind of mangled version of DNA. So it's a rolling committee. It only lasts in its kind of one state for about 6 or 12 months, and then is constantly shifting, constantly updating. But for me, it's a really kind of intriguing model of a way in which a school that doesn't necessarily need a specific space, it isn't really site specific, but it is kind of time specific or responsive in a certain kind of a way. And that can be modeled, that can be done anywhere. So I want to finish by talking about Open School East, which I suppose I started by talking about. Open School East, as I mentioned, came out of a number of conversations about 4 or 5 years ago between myself and friends and colleagues, Anna Collin, Sarah McCrory and Lawrence Taylor. And the questions I suppose we were asking ourselves was, would there be a way in which art education in London, a city where it was becoming increasingly prohibitive in terms of tuition fees as well as in terms of rent, that art education could be free, that rather than the art school being a relatively solitary experience, it could be a way in which learning was done collaboratively and in a way that was self-directed. And could there also be a way in which the art school was a more porous institution, one that was really rooted and was in dialogue with its neighborhood rather than closing its door. And what we came up with, I suppose a little like Sean Dockray's kind of diagram for a school, was something fairly simple. We managed to get hold of this space. It's a former public library in Hackney in East London. It was built in the mid-70s. And it was closed in around 2010. It was home to the Hackney Archives and the Hackney Children's Library. It was one of about 300 public libraries that was closed by the coalition government in those years, and many more have followed. So we had a kind of idea of what the space could be. It feels like a public civic institution. You kind of know how to behave in it. And really the idea was simple. It was that each year, this is the first year cohort, we would provide 13 or 14 associates with free tuition and free studio spaces for a year. In lieu of paying tuition fees, they would take a really active role in reopening this former public space. So that would mean they did not just have a kind of week-long degree show at the end. They wouldn't just be working away in their studios and then kind of pop up at the end. They would actually be meeting their publics very early on. They would be working in collaboration with different community groups, different charities, and they might range from a kind of radio show through to a primary school over the road, to be developing projects that both started before the end of the year and also lived beyond it as well. So this was a kind of question of how would one start an art school where the learning wasn't only kind of limited to that kind of 3-semester program. It actually was a kind of lifelong way of learning. And so what the associate, we didn't call them students because after all it was unaccredited and it was a self-directed course. But what the associates learned to do, among other things, was how to run an organization. Of these, it's a broad, we put out a call for entries. We had several hundred people apply from all over the world. And we didn't ask for any academic qualifications. So in the end, we had a range of people, from people who had kind of just finished high school but hadn't gone on to art school, through to somebody with a PhD. Probably only about 2/3 of them identified as artists. The others were a mixture of researchers, social scientists, dancers. And that diversity was also reflected in the people we invited to teach there too. In the course of the first year, we had about 100 people teach, and that ranged from curators, including Maria Lind, through to artists like Ed Atkins, Ahmet, you taught there too, through to a whole kind of range of filmmakers, activists, local historians, etc., etc. The idea was, as I understood it anyway, was to really kind of bombard these associates with as many different positions as voices, to kind of get away from the idea of just only being taught by a relatively narrow number of people and visiting lecturers. And in a way, I think what we realized was we'd shifted it. It was way too broad. You know, there is a kind of, you do need some continuity in education. So in the second and third years, we started a kind of mentoring program where there were about half a dozen mentors who are there every week. So there is a kind of more continual conversation. It's not just a series of visiting lecturers. But, you know, the school was called Open, and part of that was the idea that where possible, the teaching does also kind of happen in public. So if we were to have a seminar where it was relevant for there to be a broader kind of set of people there, it would be open to anybody. It would be open for free. And what I realized quite soon after we opened was that we would actually start to see students from other art schools, like real art schools, kind of attending some of the classes that we were having, precisely because although they were paying £9,000 or £22,000 a year, they were not getting very much in terms of face-to-face tuition. What we were providing was something that was really intense and in-depth, about a day a week's full-time teaching, and then probably an event or two a week in the evening. So that whole kind of range of different projects. This is the kind of hall space, and this is a seminar and film by the artist Richard John Jones. But then a lot of the way in which it works is that it's essentially two strands. There's a study program, which is kind of relatively closed to these 14 associates, and then there's a public program. Often the kind of projects they're developing are leading to that public program. So this is a forum that was organized last year by 3 of the associates at the time, Mary Toslin, John Lawrence, and Paul Mahecki, which was, the full title, Beyond Beyonce, Use It Like a Bumper, Can Hip-Hop Cultures Be Reclaimed to Offer Black Feminist Perspectives? So as you can kind of see, there's a core of like associate artists here, but there's also a kind of quite a broad range of people who, from other art school students through to people from the neighborhood. And this is kind of more of the same from the Beyond Beyonce event. A lot of the projects we did was to kind of set up different kinds of platforms that would take on a life of their own. One of these is Parallel Radio, which is a radio show that now happens monthly and is run by local residents over the age of 65. So working with the school, they learned how to use the kind of broadcast equipment. And now they have keys to the school, essentially, and come every Saturday morning and do their radio show. This is then being hosted last year at the V&A and presenting the program from there. Something else we did was to work with an artist named Arendt Angel, who's actually teaching as part of the Summer Academy, to set up a ceramics studio called Troytown Art Pottery. Aaron describes Troytown as a radical and psychedelic workshop for artists. Precisely not people who define themselves as craft. There was a question earlier about craft, actually, and this was a kind of, I think, Aaron trying to kind of move some of this conversation away from the kind of craft world that he saw as rightly or wrongly slightly stifling. But it happened at a point where a lot of the ceramics departments in art schools in the UK were actually being dismantled and sold off, which kind of ironically seemed to happen at the same time when students in the UK and probably elsewhere were getting increasingly interested with working with ceramics again, with working with textiles, with revisiting different kinds of craft techniques. So in a way, Troytown Art Pottery ran as a kind of quasi-autonomous department of Open School East for the first several years. It was Aaron's studio, but every month there were 4 resident artists. He would usually ask that there were people who hadn't worked with clay before as a medium, but that wasn't always the case. And since then, it's kind of extraordinary to see how the work has filtered out into the world. Nicole Vermers, who was nominated for the Turner Prize last year, some of her work for that show was made here in this very modest studio. So I think kind of by way of wrapping up, I almost want to go back to kind of where I started from, or kind of near where I started from, with Black Mountain College. And in 1956, the poet Charles Olson, who was a faculty member of Black Mountain, one of the last standing faculty, because at this point it was having real financial trouble. There were hardly any students left, hardly any faculty left. He sat down and drew this diagram, which in a way is a kind of prediction of the future. It's a prediction of what would happen after Black Mountain College finally closed its doors, which it did several months after he drew this. It's quite blurry, but you might just be able to make out that in the middle is typewritten the words "the college." And then pointing outwards in different directions are a number of different new institutions. To the left, a publishing house. To the right, a theatre. To the top, a magazine. And I suppose I wanted to return to this because it provides something like a kind of a metaphor or an image for, I think, some of what I've been describing in terms of what's been happening in the last 10 years or so. That the function of the school still kind of remains. It remains in some cases really umbilically tied to the institution, and yet it often takes on different kinds of guises, different kinds of formats. It might be a magazine, it might be a website, it might be a theatre, it might be something else entirely. But what I quite like about this diagram is the kind of the sense of movement, the sense of centrifugal force that the words, the college, seem to be generating kind of at the centre of this kind of world. And I think that kind of the open question here, and one that I look forward to kind of talking about a bit more of this weekend, is about the kind of what does that changing form of the art school, of the art academy mean today? What kind of relationship does it have with these institutions, new ones or otherwise? And I mean kind of most clearly put, what happens next? So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you.